5 days before my 30th birthday, I drove up the long gravel path that wound toward the Harper estate. The invitation had sounded harmless enough family dinner before your big day, but the moment I walked into the drawing room, I knew something was off. My mother, Evelyn, sat stiffly in her silk blouse. My father, Walter, had a leather folder in front of him, and my brother, Lucas, lounged in the armchair like he was waiting for a show. I barely had time to set down my purse before Walter pushed the folder across the table toward me. "Adeline," he said in the same tone he used in court sign it. I opened the folder. Inside was a contract thick enough to choke a shredder. The first page screamed its intention, a prenuptial-style agreement binding my inheritance, my company, and any future earnings into family oversight. I blinked at him. "This is a joke." Lucas laughed low and sharp. "It's not a joke, Addie. It's simple. You sign, you stay. You don't, you walk out for good." My mother folded her hands like a queen on her throne. "We've invested too much in this family's reputation to allow chaos. Consider this a formality, protection of family assets." I felt heat rush to my face. Protection from me? From poor decisions, Walter corrected without blinking. "You've always been impulsive." The words landed like a slap. I thought of the years I'd spent working quietly, building something of my own, never asking them for help. And here they were, 5 days before my birthday, threatening to cut me out of the family unless I signed away every ounce of independence I had left. I pushed the folder back across the table. "You expect me to sign this tonight?" "Yes," Evelyn said coolly. "We won't drag this out. If you're part of this family, you'll understand the necessity." I stared at their faces, my parents' calm, my brother's smug delight, and felt the ground shift under me. This wasn't about protection. It was about control. And in that moment, I realized they had no idea who they were trying to control. I stood my chair scraping against the floor and said only, "I'll need time." Then I walked out, the folder still on the table, but their ultimatum clinging to me like smoke as I drove into the night. The memories of how we'd come to this point pressed in on me before I even reached home. Driving home from the estate, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. Their ultimatum wasn't new. It was just the sharpest version of a pattern I had known my entire life. My parents had built their lives on appearances. My mother's world revolved around luncheons, curated guest lists, and ensuring the Harper name was whispered in the right circles. My father was a lawyer who believed control was the purest form of love. He raised me and Lucas to believe loyalty meant obedience, that belonging came at the price of silence. As children, Lucas was the golden one. When he threw tantrums, they laughed it off his spirit. When he failed exams, they blamed lazy teachers. He wanted things, and they arrived cars, trips, connections like the world owed him. I was different. I liked books more than parties, questions more than answers. When I suggested ideas or dreamed of building something beyond the family circle, I was patted on the head and told not to be naive. "You'll grow out of it," my mother used to say, her smile tight, her eyes already dismissing me. My father preferred sharper words. "Stop chasing fantasies, Adeline. Leave the real work to us." The only person who never asked me to shrink was my grandfather. He'd sit with me on the back porch listening to my wild plans for inventions, companies' ways of living that didn't depend on the Harper name. He'd chuckle, sip his coffee, and say, "Don't let them put you in their box, Addie. You're bigger than that." When he passed away during my last year of college, I thought I had lost my only ally. Then his will was read quietly, secretly. He had left nearly everything to me, investments he'd managed for decades, carefully hidden from my parents. $7 million and a message sealed in his handwriting: "This is yours. Build what they can't control." That letter had changed everything. It was the seed of the company I now owned, the safety net that let me chase my own path. And it was the reason I refused to let my family's ultimatum destroy what I had built, because they still believed I was just the dreamer. Back in my apartment, I sat in the quiet and let the anger settle into something sharper. For years, I had carried the truth close to my chest, choosing discretion over spectacle. My grandfather's inheritance had grown under careful investments. My own company, HarperTech, born from late nights and stubborn belief, had pushed me into a position most people only dream of. Together, they put my net worth just over $10 million, but no one would guess it. I drove a reliable sedan instead of a luxury car, lived in a modern but modest apartment, wore clothes that were professional without screaming for attention. It wasn't humility so much as strategy. The less anyone knew, the freer I was to move without the weight of expectation or worse exploitation. I thought of my parents' smug faces earlier, convinced they held the reins. They had no idea the horse had already bolted. Their arrogance thrived in the dark, fed by the illusion that I needed them, and maybe in some way my silence had allowed it. I had given them no reason to suspect, no crack in the story they built about me being the dependent, impractical daughter. I ran my hand over the desk where my files were stacked: bank statements, contracts, valuations, all proof of the life I had carved out without them. I had wanted love without conditions, family without deals or signatures. But they had turned my birthday into a transaction. For the first time, I wondered if keeping the secret had been a mistake. Maybe I had thought my quiet success would eventually earn me respect. Instead, it had made me invisible. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. If they wanted a battle over power and money, then perhaps it was time they saw exactly who they were dealing with. I reached for my phone, knowing the first call I had to make would be to the one person who had always stood in my corner. The first call I made was to Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright until she heard mine. I told her everything: the estate, the contract, the ultimatum. For a moment, there was only silence on the line, and then her outrage came spilling through. "They're treating you like property," she snapped, not even pretending to hide it. "Who does that to their own daughter?" I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of my window. Apparently mine. "You can't let them corner you into this." "Not when you have the power to end it." Her certainty steadied me. I promised I had a plan, though at that point it was more conviction than detail. After we hung up, I called Thomas Reed, the only lawyer I trusted, the man who had handled my grandfather's estate and seen me through the early stages of building HarperTech. He was retired in name, only still sharp, still formidable. When I arrived at his office the next morning, he welcomed me with the same grave kindness I remembered. I slid the thick contract across his desk. He read silently, page after page, his mouth tightening the further he went. At last, he set it down. "This isn't protection," he said flatly. "This is predatory. They want you bound so tightly you'd need their permission to breathe." The validation was a relief. "Can we fight it?" He gave me a look that almost made me smile. "We won't just fight it, we'll rewrite the rules." For the next 2 hours, we drafted a counter-agreement. It was everything theirs wasn't: balanced, precise, and ironclad. It secured my company and intellectual property, shielded my investments, and outlined terms that acknowledged me as an equal, not an asset to be managed. When we finished, Thomas leaned back. "This," he said, tapping the new document, "is what real protection looks like." I gathered the papers into my folder, feeling their weight in my hands. For the first time since the ultimatum, I wasn't just angry, I was prepared. As I left his office, I knew the next step wasn't the document itself, but deciding how and when to use it. Walking home with Thomas's counter-agreement in my bag, I felt the sharp edges of memory pressing in. This wasn't just about a contract. It was every moment that had led here, every subtle reminder that I was never enough in their eyes. I remembered Evelyn's voice at a dinner party years ago, cutting through the clink of glasses. Adeline insists on building her little software company. Such ambition. The pause that followed was deliberate, her polite smile concealing the message. Cute hobby, nothing more. Guests laughed softly, not at the joke, but at my silence. Then there was my father. When I landed my first round of funding, I called to share the news. Walter listened, then replied, "That's good, but let's be realistic. You won't keep pace with the established firms. Stay practical, Addie." He never asked what the company did. He never asked why it mattered to me. And Lucas, he treated my success as a family wallet. "You'll cover my shortfall, right? It's all the same money." He said it casually, as if my hard work existed only to cushion his failures. He never once congratulated me. He never thought he needed to. One memory bled into another until the pattern was undeniable. They had never believed in me, never respected me. The prenup wasn't a sudden act of caution. It was the natural conclusion of years spent treating me as someone to be managed, not trusted. I reached my apartment door with my hands trembling, but not from fear. It was clarity. The cracks in our family had always been there. I had just pretended they were surface scratches. Now, under the weight of their ultimatum, the fractures were splitting wide open. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, knowing the next time I faced them, I wouldn't be the same daughter they thought they could dismiss. 2 nights later, I returned to the estate folder in hand, but unopened. Evelyn had called it a final discussion, her tone suggesting magnanimity as if I were being offered a chance at redemption. When I walked into the study, my father and Lucas were already there. Evelyn followed moments later, holding a glass of wine like it was a prop in a play she'd rehearsed 100 times. They were smiling, calm, certain. It was the look of people who had already decided the ending. Adeline, Walter began gesturing toward the leather chair opposite him. "Let's not make this more difficult than it has to be. You've had time to think. I trust you see this agreement is not only reasonable but necessary." Lucas leaned back in his seat, his grin edged with mockery. "Honestly, Addie, just sign it. We all know you wouldn't last a year without the family backing you." Evelyn added her own quiet blade. "Loyalty is what holds us together. You've benefited from the Harper name your entire life. This is about protecting that legacy." I sat folding my hands in my lap and let their words wash over me. Once, they would have stung. Now I heard only the rhythm of control, the language of people who couldn't imagine being challenged. "I see," I said evenly, giving nothing away. Across the room, Sophie sat near the window, invited perhaps to witness my capitulation. She didn't speak, but I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't comfortable with this performance, though she wasn't ready to defy it either. Her silence was a small crack in their united front, and I tucked it away like a card, yet to be played. Walter slid the contract closer to me. "It's time to sign, Adeline. We can't delay any longer." I placed my hand on the folder, but I didn't open it. Instead, I looked at each of them in turn, holding their gaze long enough to unsettle. "I'll consider everything you've said," I replied, my tone calm, almost indifferent. They mistook my composure for resignation, which was exactly what I wanted. When I left the study, their smugness lingered in the air, but so did my silence. A silence, heavy with the plan I had yet to unveil. The dining room was staged as if for celebration. China-polished silverware, gleaming wine poured before I even sat down. My parents flanked the table like dignitaries at a summit, and Lucas lounged at the end with a smirk that told me he believed the matter already settled. I waited until the first course was cleared before I set my leather folder on the table. "I've reviewed the agreement," I said evenly, "and I've prepared one of my own." Evelyn's laugh was soft, almost pitying. "Darling, this isn't a negotiation. You're not in a position to dictate terms." Walter leaned back indulgent. "We don't need revisions. Just a signature." I slid the counter contract across the linen. "Read it. It's balanced. It protects everyone's interests." Lucas snorted. "Balanced. Don't waste our time. You don't have assets worth protecting." That was when I placed the second set of documents on top of the contract: bank statements, investment portfolios, and the valuation of my company. "Actually, I do. Roughly $10 million worth." The silence that followed was almost tangible. Walter's hand froze on his glass. Evelyn's smile slipped her mouth parting as if words had abandoned her. Even Sophie, seated quietly to the side, widened her eyes. Lucas broke first, his face twisting. 10 million. "And you never said a word?" "You let us plan. You let us think," I interrupted calmly. "I didn't let you think anything. You assumed and you dismissed me over and over because you believed I had nothing." His voice rose no longer smooth but desperate. "You were supposed to be the fallback. I counted on." He stopped too late, the truth already spilling out. I leaned back in my chair, watching the cracks spread across their expressions. For once, I wasn't the one cornered. The throne they thought they held so securely was shifting beneath them, and I intended to make sure it stayed that way as the night unfolded. The air in the dining room thickened after Lucas's outburst, but I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I reached into my folder once more and handed Thomas Reed the floor. He had been waiting calmly, his expression composed, as though this was the moment he had anticipated all along. He adjusted his glasses and spread the counter contract open. This agreement, he began, his voice steady, ensures equal protection for both parties. It preserves family assets, yes, but it also safeguards Ms. Harper's holdings, intellectual property, and independent business interests. It is comprehensive, balanced, and enforceable. Walter bristled. This isn't how our agreements work. Thomas didn't flinch. Then perhaps it's time your agreements evolve. The leverage you believed you had is no longer valid. Your daughter is not dependent. She is your equal. Walter's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment, the truth dawning with visible weight. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that their position had collapsed, that his authority had been undermined by facts he couldn't ignore. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone softening into something meant to wound less, but it was only another tactic. Adeline, we're family. You don't need to prove yourself to us. This secrecy, these documents, why turn us into adversaries? I met her gaze evenly. Because you made yourselves adversaries the moment you demanded my obedience instead of my trust. Family isn't control. Family is respect. You've never offered me that. For the first time, her composure cracked the mask, slipping just enough to show discomfort. Across the table, Sophie cleared her throat, her voice quiet but steady. She's right. Maybe it's time we start listening instead of assuming. Her words weren't much, but they were a fracture in the wall my parents had built around themselves, a reminder that not every bond in this bloodline was poisoned. I closed my folder not with finality, but with resolve. They knew the ground had shifted, and I was no longer standing on the weaker side. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time I could see them scrambling for footing. They no longer held. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the Harper family shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. At gatherings, I noticed the difference in how people addressed me. Aunts and uncles who once dismissed my work now asked careful questions about my company, their curiosity tinged with caution. Others, like Lucas, barely concealed their resentment. Their greetings clipped their eyes sharp with unspoken accusations. Thomas moved swiftly, filing paperwork that locked every door my parents might try to pry open. My assets were sealed under protections they couldn't override. My intellectual property ringed with legal fortifications. He handed me copies of the finalized documents with a rare smile. "You're untouchable now," he said, and for the first time I believed it. The liberation was real, but it came wrapped in a quiet grief. Any lingering hope that my parents would one day see me without conditions evaporated in that dining room. Respect born of exposure wasn't respect at all. It was compliance forced by numbers on a page. I found myself replaying moments from childhood, searching for warmth that maybe had never been there. My grandfather's voice, steady and proud, became the only true anchor in that past. His faith in me had been the seed of everything, and now I understood why he chose to bypass the family altogether. Walking out of Thomas's office with the final papers in my hands, I felt lighter, yes, but also alone in a way I hadn't expected. Blood had tied me to them, but the bond of love had been severed long before the ultimatum. My birthday was approaching, and with it the decision of how to mark this new beginning on my own terms. On the evening of my birthday, my apartment was filled with voices that rang with laughter instead of judgment. Rachel had taken over the kitchen, insisting on cooking while Sophie arrived with flowers she'd chosen herself, a quiet gesture that meant more than words. Around the table sat people who had walked beside me by choice, not obligation friends, who knew me for my ideas, my stubbornness, my victories and failures. There was no polished silver, no speeches about legacy, no undercurrent of competition, just warmth, the kind I had longed for in my own family but never received. As I watched Rachel and Sophie banter across the table, I realized how rare and precious it was to be surrounded by people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they expected to gain something. When the cake was set in front of me, its candles flickering, I didn't make the usual silent wish. Instead, I felt the certainty of a vow forming in my chest. I would never again dim myself to keep others comfortable. I would not fold under control disguised as loyalty. Blood may have tied me to the ruins, but loyalty, respect, and love defined the family I chose. and sitting there, I knew I already had everything I needed. As the candles melted into soft pools of wax, I blew them out with a steady breath, not asking for change, but sealing the life I had already claimed. My life was mine unapologetically, and I would never hide my light again. Adeline learns a profound lesson about the true nature of family and self-worth. Initially, she hopes her quiet success will earn her family's respect, but their ultimatum reveals their view of her as a controllable asset, not an equal. This forces her to confront a painful truth. Their love is conditional, rooted in control rather than genuine care. Through her grandfather's faith and her own achievements, she realizes that family isn't defined by blood or obligation, but by mutual respect and trust. By standing firm with her counter-agreement, she reclaims her independence, understanding that her value doesn't depend on their approval. The experience teaches her to embrace her strength unapologetically, choosing relationships with those who value her for who she is, not what she can provide. On her 30th birthday, surrounded by chosen family, she vows never to dim her light for others' comfort. This shift from seeking validation to asserting her worth marks her liberation, affirming that true belonging comes from self-acceptance and the courage to define her own path, free from the constraints of those who seek to limit her.
The TechCrunch notification appeared on my phone at 6:23 a.m. while I was reviewing the final acquisition documents. Digital marketing agency Spectrum Creative completes $12 million triple acquisition in aggressive expansion strategy. I screenshot the headline and set my phone aside, focusing on the stack of legal paperwork that required my signature before the market opened. 24 hours earlier, I'd been sitting across from my parents at their kitchen table in suburban Phoenix, listening to their familiar concerns about my career stability. Mom had prepared my favorite meal, her famous enchiladas, but the conversation had quickly shifted to what she viewed as my precarious professional situation. "Sarah, we love that you're creative and entrepreneurial," Dad had said, carefully choosing his words. "But freelancing doesn't provide the security that a corporate position offers. No benefits, no guaranteed income, no retirement planning." Mom had nodded in agreement, refilling my water glass. "Your cousin Jennifer just got promoted to marketing director at Intel. She has a 401k, health insurance, paid vacation. That's the kind of stability we want for you." I'd listened respectfully while cutting into my enchilada. At 29, I'd grown accustomed to these conversations with my parents, who viewed my freelancing through the lens of their own corporate careers. Dad had spent 35 years as an accountant at the same firm. Mom had worked 28 years in human resources at the state university. Their definition of career success centered on predictable paychecks and comprehensive benefits packages. "I understand your concerns," I'd replied diplomatically. "Financial security is definitely important. We just want you to have options," Mom had continued. "What happens if clients stop hiring you? What if you get sick and can't work? Freelancers don't have the safety net that employees have." Their worries weren't unreasonable. From their perspective, I was a freelance graphic designer and marketing consultant who worked from home, took on various projects, and lacked the traditional markers of professional stability. They'd watched me navigate the uncertainty of entrepreneurship for 7 years, and their parental instincts made them anxious about my long-term financial security. What they didn't fully understand was that Spectrum Creative had evolved far beyond freelancing into a full-service digital marketing agency with 23 employees, a portfolio of Fortune 500 clients, and annual revenue approaching $8 million. The projects I worked on included comprehensive digital transformation initiatives for major corporations, not small business logo designs. But I deliberately kept the specifics of my business growth private, partly from professional discretion and partly because I didn't want to seem like I was lecturing my parents about entrepreneurship. When they asked about work, I usually gave general responses about staying busy or landing new clients. "Have you considered applying to larger companies?" Dad had suggested. "Your marketing background would translate well to a corporate environment. You could probably start as a marketing coordinator and work your way up to director level." "That's definitely something to consider," I'd agreed, not wanting to dismiss their advice outright. The conversation had continued through dessert, with my parents offering well-intentioned guidance about resume writing, networking strategies, and the importance of building relationships with corporate recruiters. They meant well, and their concern for my financial future was genuinely motivated by love and parental protection. But as I'd driven back to my apartment that evening, I'd reflected on the disconnect between their perception of my career and the reality of what Spectrum Creative had become. The next morning's acquisition announcement would bridge that gap in unexpected ways. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Jessica Martinez, my business partner and chief operating officer. Sarah, the TechCrunch article is getting significant pickup. Forbes is requesting an interview about our acquisition strategy, and I've got 3 potential clients wanting to discuss expanded service offerings. That's great news. Are the legal documents finalized for all 3 acquisitions? Just received confirmation from our attorneys. Pixel Perfect Studios, Data-Driven Media, and Creative Solutions Group are now officially part of Spectrum Creative. The combined employee count is 67 people across 4 offices. Jessica and I had been planning this expansion for 18 months, carefully identifying smaller agencies whose capabilities complemented our existing services. Pixel Perfect brought advanced web development expertise, Data-Driven added sophisticated analytics and marketing automation, and Creative Solutions expanded our content creation capacity. What's the total investment for the 3 acquisitions? $12.3 million, with $4.2 million in cash and the remainder in equity stakes and performance-based earnouts. Our projected combined revenue for next year is $18.5 million. The numbers represented a significant leap in scale and capability for Spectrum Creative. The acquisitions positioned us to compete for larger enterprise contracts while expanding our geographic reach into new markets. More importantly, they brought talented professionals whose expertise would enhance our service offerings across digital marketing, web development, and content strategy. Jessica, I need to make a call to my parents. The TechCrunch coverage is probably going to generate some family questions. Good luck with that conversation. See you at the team meeting this afternoon. After Jessica hung up, I sat quietly for a few minutes, considering how to explain the acquisition news to my parents. Their concerns about freelancing stability weren't wrong. Entrepreneurship did involve financial risks that traditional employment avoided. But Spectrum Creative had grown into a stable business with diversified revenue streams, long-term client contracts, and substantial financial reserves. I called Mom's cell phone, knowing she'd be having coffee and reading the morning news. Sarah, I was just thinking about our conversation last night. Your father and I found some corporate marketing positions online that might interest you. Mom, I appreciate you looking, but I need to share some news about my business. Did you see any technology news this morning? Technology news? No, why? TechCrunch published an article about Spectrum Creative this morning. We completed 3 major acquisitions yesterday. There was a pause. Acquisitions? Sarah, what exactly is Spectrum Creative? I realized that despite 7 years of building the business, I'd never clearly explained the company's scope and structure to my parents. From their perspective, Spectrum Creative was simply the name I used for my freelancing work. Mom, Spectrum Creative is a digital marketing agency. We have 23 full-time employees and offices in Phoenix, Denver, and Austin. Yesterday we acquired 3 smaller agencies, which brings our total team to 67 people. 67 employees? Sarah, are you saying you own a company with 67 employees? Yes. Jessica Martinez and I are co-founders. We started the agency 7 years ago, and it's grown into a full-service digital marketing firm. Our clients include several Fortune 500 companies. Mom was quiet for a long moment. Honey, why didn't you tell us about this sooner? I guess I thought you understood the scope of what we were building. When you asked about work, I focused on individual projects rather than the overall business strategy. But you let us worry about your lack of job security for years. We had no idea you were running a multi-million-dollar company. Her tone wasn't accusatory, but I could hear the confusion and concern in her voice. She was processing the disconnect between their perception of my career and the reality of what I'd built. Mom, I didn't want to seem like I was bragging or dismissing your concerns about entrepreneurship. The risks you mentioned are real. Business ownership does involve financial uncertainty that traditional employment doesn't have. Sarah, there's a difference between taking calculated risks as a business owner and struggling as a freelancer. We thought you were the latter. That was a fair distinction. My parents' advice about corporate employment had been based on their assumption that I was working project to project without stable income or benefits. They hadn't understood that Spectrum Creative provided both financial stability and growth opportunities that exceeded most corporate positions. Can you explain what these acquisitions mean for your business? The 3 agencies we acquired have complementary capabilities that expand our service offerings. Pixel Perfect specializes in advanced web development, Data-Driven brings marketing automation expertise, and Creative Solutions has a strong content creation team. And the $12 million investment? That represents the total value of the 3 acquisitions, including cash payments, equity stakes, and performance incentives. It positions Spectrum Creative to compete for larger enterprise contracts while expanding our geographic reach. Mom was processing this information carefully. Sarah, this sounds like sophisticated business strategy, not freelancing. It is. Jessica and I have been planning this expansion for 18 months. We identified agencies whose capabilities would strengthen our competitive position and enhance our service delivery for existing clients. Why didn't you share these plans with us? That was a reasonable question. I'd been so focused on executing the business strategy that I hadn't considered how my parents might benefit from understanding the long-term vision for Spectrum Creative. I suppose I assumed you weren't interested in the technical details of digital marketing. When we talked about work, the conversation usually focused on general career advice rather than specific business operations. But we've been worried about your financial security for years. If we'd understood what you were building, we could have offered more relevant support and advice. He was right. My parents had extensive experience with financial planning, organizational management, and strategic decision-making from their corporate careers. Their perspective on business development could have been valuable during Spectrum Creative's growth phases. Mom, would you and Dad be interested in learning more about the agency's operations and growth strategy? Absolutely. Your father has experience with financial planning and budgeting that might be helpful. And I understand organizational development from my HR background. That would be really valuable. Jessica and I are always looking for experienced perspectives on business strategy and operational efficiency. Sarah, I need to apologize for our conversation last night. We were giving you career advice based on incomplete information about your actual professional situation. You don't need to apologize. Your concerns about entrepreneurship were legitimate, and your advice about financial security was sound. I should have been clearer about Spectrum Creative's growth and stability. Still, we spent dinner trying to convince you to abandon a successful business in favor of entry-level corporate positions. That's embarrassing. I appreciated her directness. Mom, your advice came from genuine concern for my financial future. That's what good parents do. They worry about their children's security and offer guidance based on their own experience. But our guidance was based on outdated assumptions about your career. We thought you were struggling as a freelancer, not thriving as a business owner. The distinction between freelancing and agency ownership isn't always clear from the outside. Many people use the terms interchangeably. Mom was quiet for a moment. Sarah, can you help us understand what running a digital marketing agency actually involves? I appreciated her genuine interest. Digital marketing agencies help companies develop and execute online marketing strategies. We provide services like website development, search engine optimization, social media management, content creation, and data analytics. And your clients are Fortune 500 companies? Several of them, yes. We also work with mid-sized companies and growing startups. The client diversity helps stabilize our revenue streams and reduces dependence on any single account. What does your role involve as co-founder? I focus on client strategy, business development, and creative direction. Jessica handles operations, financial management, and team development. We work together on major strategic decisions like the acquisitions we completed yesterday. This sounds much more complex than we realized. It is. Managing a digital marketing agency requires expertise in technology, creative strategy, financial management, and client relationship development. It's definitely more complicated than traditional freelancing. Sarah, your father and I owe you an apology and a congratulations. We clearly didn't understand what you'd accomplished with Spectrum Creative. Thank you, Mom. But I also want to acknowledge that your concerns about entrepreneurship weren't wrong. Business ownership does involve risks that traditional employment doesn't have. What kind of risks? Revenue fluctuations, client concentration, market competition, technology changes, regulatory compliance. Jessica and I spend significant time managing these risks through diversification strategies and financial planning. So you do have the equivalent of corporate benefits and retirement planning? Yes, but we've had to create those systems ourselves rather than relying on employer-provided programs. We have group health insurance for all employees, 401k matching and profit-sharing plans. Mom was processing this information thoughtfully. That actually sounds more comprehensive than many corporate benefit packages. It is, but it also requires more active management. We can't rely on HR departments to handle these programs. We have to design and oversee them ourselves. I imagine that's both challenging and rewarding. Exactly. It's more work than being an employee, but it also provides more control over business strategy and company culture. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad. Just saw the TechCrunch article about your company. Call when you can. Mom, Dad just texted about the TechCrunch coverage. Should we continue this conversation when I get home this weekend? Yes, please. We'd love to learn more about Spectrum Creative and how we can better support what you're building. I'd appreciate that. And Mom, thank you for being open to reassessing your understanding of my career. Sarah, we're proud of what you've accomplished. We just wish we'd understood it sooner. After we hung up, I spent the morning reviewing client proposals and preparing for the team meeting to introduce the newly acquired employees. The integration process would require careful attention to company culture, operational procedures, and client relationship management. But the conversation with Mom had highlighted an important lesson about communication with family members who came from different professional backgrounds. Their advice about corporate employment had been well-intentioned but based on incomplete information about Spectrum Creative's actual structure and stability. Jessica arrived at the office early for our integration planning session. How did the conversation with your parents go? Better than expected. They were surprised to learn about the scale of what we've built, but they're genuinely interested in understanding the business better. That's great. Having experienced advisors who understand financial planning and organizational development could be valuable as we scale the combined operation. Exactly. My dad has 35 years of accounting experience, and my mom understands HR systems and organizational behavior. Their perspective on the integration challenges could be helpful. Should we invite them to visit the office and see the operation firsthand? I think they'd appreciate that. It would help them understand what digital marketing agency work actually involves. The team meeting that afternoon brought together employees from all 4 locations via video conference. The energy was positive as people introduced themselves and discussed how their capabilities would complement existing service offerings. Mark Thompson from Pixel Perfect presented their web development process, which would enhance our ability to deliver complex e-commerce solutions. Lisa Chin from Data Driven explained their marketing automation platform, which would improve our analytics and lead generation capabilities. David Rodriguez from Creative Solutions outlined their content creation workflow, which would expand our capacity for video production and graphic design. The integration demonstrated the strategic value of the acquisitions. Rather than simply adding employees, we were combining complementary expertise to create enhanced service offerings that none of the individual agencies could have provided independently. After the meeting, I called Dad back. Sarah, I've been reading about Spectrum Creative online. I had no idea you were running such a sophisticated operation. Thanks, Dad. I realize I should have been clearer about the business structure and growth trajectory. The TechCrunch article mentioned $18.5 million in projected revenue for next year. That's substantial for a 7-year-old company. The acquisitions significantly expand our capabilities and market reach. We're positioned to compete for enterprise contracts that require multidisciplinary teams and geographic coverage. And you're co-founder with Jessica Martinez? That's right. Jessica handles the operational and financial aspects while I focus on strategy and client development. We make major decisions collaboratively. Sarah, I have to ask, why did you let your mother and me worry about your job security for so long? That was a direct question that deserved an honest answer. I suppose I was so focused on building the business that I didn't consider how the lack of communication was affecting your perception of my career stability. We spent years encouraging you to find real employment while you were building a multi-million-dollar company. Your concerns about entrepreneurship weren't wrong, Dad. Business ownership does involve financial risks and uncertainty that traditional employment avoids. But there's a difference between taking calculated risks as an established business owner and struggling to find steady freelance work. That's true. I should have been clearer about Spectrum Creative's financial stability and growth trajectory. Dad was quiet for a moment. Sarah, can you help me understand the financial structure of the acquisitions? The article mentioned cash payments and equity stakes. I appreciated his interest in the business details. We paid $4.2 million in cash for immediate ownership, with additional payments tied to performance metrics over the next 2 years. The equity stakes give the acquired team's ownership interest in the combined company's future growth. That sounds like sophisticated deal structuring. It is. We worked with investment bankers and legal counsel to design terms that protect our financial position while incentivizing the acquired teams to contribute to long-term success. And this positions Spectrum Creative for what kind of future growth? Our goal is to reach $30 million in annual revenue within 3 years while expanding into new service areas like artificial intelligence and marketing automation. The acquisitions provide the technical expertise and market presence to support that growth. Sarah, that's impressive strategic planning. I wish we'd understood what you were building. Dad, would you be interested in reviewing our financial planning and budgeting processes? Your accounting experience could help us improve our financial management systems. Absolutely. I'd love to contribute to what you've built. And Mom's HR experience could be valuable as we integrate 67 employees from 4 different company cultures. We'd both be honored to help however we can. The conversation with Dad reinforced the value of better communication about business strategy and financial planning with family members who had relevant professional experience. Their advice about career development had been based on incomplete information, but their expertise in financial management and organizational development could contribute meaningfully to Spectrum Creative's continued growth. That evening, I prepared a presentation for my parents that explained the company's history, current operations, financial structure, and strategic plans. The acquisition announcement had created an opportunity to involve them more meaningfully in understanding and supporting what Jessica and I had built. The presentation covered Spectrum Creative's evolution from a 2-person startup to a regional digital marketing agency with national clients. It detailed our service offerings, client portfolio, employee development programs, and financial performance over 7 years of operation. But more importantly, it addressed their original concerns about freelancing instability by demonstrating how we'd built systematic approaches to revenue diversification, client retention, competitive differentiation, and financial planning that provided the security they valued in traditional employment. The weekend visit home would give us an opportunity to discuss these topics in detail and explore how their professional experience could contribute to the challenges and opportunities that came with scaling a professional services business. Most significantly, the conversation had highlighted the importance of clear communication about career development and business strategy with family members whose support and perspective could enhance professional decision-making. Their concerns about financial security had been legitimate and well-intentioned, even when based on incomplete information about Spectrum Creative's actual structure and stability. The acquisition announcement had bridged that communication gap and created opportunities for deeper involvement in the strategic planning and operational challenges that came with rapid business growth. That involvement would strengthen both family relationships and business outcomes as Spectrum Creative continued to expand its capabilities and market presence. On Friday morning, I drove to Phoenix for the weekend visit. My parents had prepared thoughtful questions about digital marketing, business strategy, and entrepreneurship based on their research into Spectrum Creative's industry and competitive position. The conversation that followed was substantive and productive, covering everything from client acquisition strategies to employee development programs to financial planning for business expansion. Their professional experience provided valuable perspective on operational challenges and strategic opportunities that Jessica and I hadn't fully considered. Most importantly, the weekend demonstrated how honest communication about professional accomplishments could strengthen family relationships while creating opportunities for meaningful advice and support. My parents' transition from concern about freelancing instability to enthusiasm about business strategy reflected their ability to reassess assumptions when presented with complete information. The experience reinforced my commitment to better communication about Spectrum Creative's growth and strategic direction with family members whose experience and perspective could contribute to continued success. Their support, both emotional and professional, would be valuable as Jessica and I navigated the challenges and opportunities that came with leading a rapidly expanding digital marketing agency. The email arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Congressional Subcommittee on Children and Families requests your testimony regarding the Child Welfare Modernization Act. Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please confirm availability. I stared at my laptop screen in the dim light of my home office, surrounded by case files and policy research that had consumed my evening. 15 years of social work practice, 5 years developing evidence-based intervention programs, countless late nights documenting outcomes and writing policy recommendations. All leading to this moment, an invitation to testify before Congress about child welfare reform. I confirmed my availability and spent the next 36 hours preparing testimony that would translate complex social work practice into language that lawmakers could understand and act upon. The policy research I'd been conducting quietly for years suddenly felt urgent and vital. But first I had dinner plans with my parents. Wednesday evening at their house, the same weekly tradition we'd maintained since I moved back to the DC area after graduate school. Dad's famous barbecue chicken, Mom's potato salad, and inevitably, Dad's gentle but persistent questions about when I'd consider a more practical career. Jennifer's here. Mom called as I walked through their front door carrying a bottle of wine in my laptop bag. The familiar scent of Dad's barbecue sauce filled the house, mixing with the sound of evening news from the living room television. "How was work today, sweetheart?" Dad asked, emerging from the kitchen with grilling tongs in hand. At 71, he still handled all outdoor cooking duties with the precision of his former engineering career. "Busy," I replied, setting my wine on the kitchen counter. "Finished a major project that's been consuming most of my time lately." "Another report about troubled families?" he asked, and I could hear the familiar concern in his voice. "I worry about you spending so much time around those situations." Dad had never understood my choice to pursue social work. As a retired aerospace engineer who'd spent 40 years designing systems that either worked perfectly or failed catastrophically, he struggled with the ambiguous nature of human services work. Problems that couldn't be solved with mathematical precision frustrated his analytical mind. "The families aren't troubled," I corrected gently, a conversation we'd had dozens of times. "They're dealing with complex systemic challenges that require coordinated intervention." "If you say so," he replied, returning to the kitchen to check on dinner preparations. "Though I still think your talents could be better applied to problems with clear solutions." Mom appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How many families are you working with now?" she asked. "Direct practice caseload is about 30 families," I explained. "But most of my time lately has been focused on program evaluation and policy development." "Policy development?" Dad repeated, pausing in his dinner preparations. "What kind of policies?" "Evidence-based interventions for child welfare systems," I said, accepting that this conversation would probably follow its usual pattern of Dad trying to understand work that seemed frustratingly unmeasurable to his engineering mindset. "Social work is bleeding heart nonsense," Dad grumbled, carrying plates to the dining room table. "Doesn't solve real problems. Just creates more paperwork and bureaucracy." I followed him to the dining room, helping Mom set the table with her good china. "Actually, evidence-based practice focuses on measurable outcomes and data-driven interventions." "But does it actually work?" he asked, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Can you point to specific families and say, 'I fixed this problem'?" "Social work doesn't fix people," I explained, sitting down across from Mom. "It creates conditions and provides resources that enable families to address their own challenges." Dad served the barbecue chicken with the same methodical precision he'd applied to engineering projects. "That sounds like a lot of words to avoid admitting you can't measure success." "We can measure success," I said calmly. "Reduced child abuse rates, increased family stability, improved educational outcomes, decreased involvement with juvenile justice systems. The data exists." If you say so, he replied skeptically. Though it seems like those problems just keep getting worse despite all the social workers. I accepted his perspective without argument, the same way I'd learned to navigate family dynamics over years of professional training in conflict resolution and systems thinking. Dad's skepticism about social work reflected broader societal misunderstandings about the field, and family dinner wasn't the appropriate venue for comprehensive education about evidence-based practice. Tell us about this project you finished, Mom suggested, clearly trying to redirect conversation toward more neutral territory. Policy research and program evaluation, I replied simply. Analyzing intervention outcomes and developing recommendations for system improvements. More reports that no one will read, Dad muttered, cutting his chicken with surgical precision. I mentioned helping a few families navigate complex situations, but kept the details general. Professional confidentiality prevented sharing specifics, and my family had heard enough case stories over the years to understand the basic challenges of child welfare work without needing additional examples. Jennifer works so hard, Mom said supportively. She's always writing reports and attending meetings about improving services for families. Meetings, Dad repeated with mild disdain. Engineers build things. We design systems that solve specific problems. Social workers have meetings about problems. Different types of problems require different approaches, I said diplomatically. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and Mom's famous apple pie. Dad reached for the television remote, flipping through channels until he found the evening news. The familiar rhythm of family time continued with half-focused attention on current events and gentle conversation about weekend plans. Let's see what's happening in the world, Dad said, settling back in his favorite recliner with his coffee. The local news covered traffic accidents and weather forecasts. National news discussed economic policy and international developments. Then the anchor transitioned to legislative coverage. Tomorrow's congressional hearings will address several significant policy initiatives, including proposed reforms to the nation's child welfare system. I glanced up from my coffee, recognizing the context for my upcoming testimony. The Child Welfare Modernization Act has attracted bipartisan support, the anchor continued, with lawmakers citing evidence-based research demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated intervention programs. Child welfare reform, Mom said thoughtfully. That's the kind of work Jennifer does, isn't it? Similar issues, I confirmed, not mentioning my direct involvement in the policy development process. More bureaucracy, Dad commented predictably. Congress solving problems by creating more paperwork for social workers. The news segment concluded with information about tomorrow's hearing schedule, and Dad changed the channel to find something more engaging than legislative coverage. We spent the remainder of the evening discussing family plans for the upcoming holidays and Dad's latest home improvement projects. I should get going, I said around 9 o'clock, gathering my purse and laptop bag. Early morning tomorrow. More meetings? Dad asked with familiar resignation. Something like that, I replied, hugging them both goodbye. Thursday morning arrived with unusual nervousness. Despite years of public speaking and professional presentations, testifying before Congress felt different. The weight of representing not just my own research, but the entire social work profession's approach to child welfare, created pressure I hadn't anticipated. I reviewed my testimony one final time while drinking coffee in my kitchen, surrounded by research data that would hopefully translate into meaningful policy changes. 5 pages of carefully crafted language that synthesized 15 years of direct practice experience with rigorous program evaluation and outcome measurement. The hearing room filled gradually with lawmakers, advocates, researchers, and media representatives. I sat at the witness table alongside 3 other experts: a child psychologist, a family court judge, and a former foster youth who'd become a legal advocate. The diversity of perspectives represented the complex, interdisciplinary nature of child welfare reform. The subcommittee will come to order, Chairman Williams announced, and I felt the familiar focus that accompanied professional presentations. This was work I understood, policy development based on evidence and experience. Each witness provided opening statements before the questioning period began. I listened to my colleagues describe their perspectives on current system challenges and proposed solutions, recognizing themes that aligned with my own research findings. Dr. Martinez, Chairman Williams said, addressing me directly, Your research on evidence-based intervention programs has been cited extensively in the policy development process. Can you explain how data-driven approaches improve outcomes for children and families? I leaned forward to the microphone, drawing on 15 years of experience translating complex social work concepts into language that non-practitioners could understand. Thank you, Chairman Williams. Evidence-based practice in social work means using interventions that have been rigorously tested and proven effective through controlled studies. Instead of relying on intuition or tradition, we implement programs with documented success rates and measurable outcomes. Can you provide specific examples of these measurable outcomes? Representative Chen asked. Certainly. The intervention programs we've evaluated show 37% reduction in repeat child abuse reports, 52% improvement in family stability measures, and 41% increase in children remaining safely with their families rather than entering foster care. I spent the next 20 minutes explaining research methodology, outcome measurement, and cost-effectiveness analysis. The questions from lawmakers demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how evidence-based social work practice could inform policy decisions and improve system efficiency. Dr. Martinez, Representative Johnson said near the end of my testimony, your research suggests that strategic investment in prevention services actually reduces long-term costs to child welfare systems. Can you elaborate on those findings? Every dollar invested in evidence-based prevention programs saves approximately $4 in crisis intervention costs, I explained. Families who receive appropriate early intervention services require less intensive and expensive services later. The hearing continued for 2 hours with detailed discussions about implementation strategies, funding mechanisms, and timeline for system reforms. I found myself energized by the opportunity to translate years of research into potential policy changes that could benefit thousands of families. Following the hearing, I spent another hour responding to media questions and speaking with congressional staff about implementation details. The complexity of translating research into legislation required careful attention to language and practical considerations. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our regular Wednesday dinner, which had been rescheduled due to my congressional testimony. I felt exhausted but satisfied, the way I always did after significant professional presentations. How was your day, sweetheart? Mom asked as I walked through their front door. Productive, I replied, setting down my laptop bag. Long but productive. More meetings about social work? Dad asked from his position at the stove, stirring his famous pasta sauce. Something like that, I said, washing my hands at the kitchen sink. We settled into our familiar dinner routine with conversation about family news and weekend plans. Dad asked about my work with typical skepticism, and I provided general responses about policy research and program evaluation. The congressional testimony felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. After dinner, we moved to the living room for coffee and television. Mom reached for the remote control, flipping through channels until she found the evening news. Let's see what happened in the world today, she said, settling back on the couch with her coffee. The local news covered typical evening stories: traffic, weather, local politics. Then the anchor transitioned to national coverage. On Capitol Hill today, lawmakers heard testimony about proposed reforms to the nation's child welfare system. I glanced up from my coffee, recognizing the hearing room where I'd spent my afternoon. The Child Welfare Modernization Act received strong support from expert witnesses who testified about the effectiveness of evidence-based intervention programs, the anchor continued. The camera cut to footage from the hearing room, showing the witness table where I'd sat alongside my colleagues. There I was, leaning toward the microphone during my testimony, wearing the navy blue suit I'd chosen specifically for the occasion. Among the witnesses was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, whose research on evidence-based social work practice has influenced policy development nationwide. The anchor explained as my name appeared on screen. Mom's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "Honey," she said slowly, "isn't that Jennifer speaking to Congress?" Dad looked up from his newspaper, staring at the television screen where my photograph appeared alongside impressive statistics about intervention outcomes and cost-effectiveness analysis. Dr. Martinez's research demonstrates that strategic investment in prevention services can reduce child welfare costs while improving outcomes for families. The news anchor continued, showing footage of me explaining research findings to congressional representatives. "That's our daughter," Mom said as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Jennifer is testifying before Congress." The news segment continued with clips from my testimony, highlighting key research findings and policy recommendations. Seeing myself on television felt strange, like watching a professional presentation by someone I barely recognized. "Evidence-based social work practice," Dad repeated slowly, his engineering mind clearly processing new information. "That sounds more systematic than I understood." Dr. Martinez's research has been published in major policy journals and cited by lawmakers developing child welfare legislation, the anchor explained, displaying publication statistics that I hadn't mentioned during family conversations. "Published research?" Dad asked, looking at me with confusion. "You never mentioned publishing research." "I write reports and evaluations," I said simply. "Publication is part of the process for sharing findings with other practitioners and policymakers." The news segment concluded with information about the proposed legislation and timeline for congressional action. My photograph remained on screen as the anchor transitioned to other national news stories. Dad reached for the remote control and muted the television. The living room fell silent except for the distant sound of evening traffic outside their house. "Jennifer," he said quietly, "I had no idea what you were really doing." "I'm doing social work," I replied. "The same work I've been describing for years." "But testifying before Congress," Mom said, still staring at the television screen. "Your research influencing national policy. That's not what I pictured when you talked about helping families." "Social work practice informs policy development," I explained. "Direct service experience provides data that can improve systems for all families." Dad set down his newspaper and looked at me directly. "All this time I've been dismissing your work as bleeding heart nonsense, and you've been conducting research that influences national legislation. Evidence-based practice requires rigorous data collection and outcome measurement," I said. "The same systematic approach you used in engineering applied to human services." "But why didn't you explain it that way?" he asked. "All these years of family dinners and you never mentioned testifying before Congress or publishing policy research. You never seemed interested in the technical aspects," I replied honestly. "When I talked about research methodology or outcome measurement, your eyes would glaze over." Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing information that clearly challenged his understanding of social work as unmeasurable and ineffective. "So when you talk about helping families," Mom said slowly, "you're actually developing programs that help thousands of families. Direct practice with individual families provides insights that can improve services for many families," I confirmed. "Casework and policy work are connected." "And this research gets published in academic journals?" Dad asked, his engineering background appreciating the peer review process. "Policy journals, practice journals, research publications," I said. "Evidence-based practice requires sharing findings so other practitioners can implement effective interventions." Dad stood up and walked to the bookshelf where Mom displayed family photographs. He picked up a picture from my graduate school graduation, where I stood proudly in my cap and gown with my Master of Social Work degree. "I remember being worried about your career choice," he said, studying the photograph. "Social work seems so unmeasurable. I thought you were avoiding concrete problem solving." "Social work is concrete problem solving," I said gently. "It just requires different tools than engineering." "Tools like research methodology and outcome measurement," he said, beginning to understand the systematic nature of evidence-based practice. "And data analysis, program evaluation, policy development," I added. "The same logical thinking you taught me applied to family systems instead of mechanical systems." Mom reached for her phone, clearly searching for more information about my congressional testimony. "There are articles about your research online," she said. "Multiple publications about child welfare policy. Research dissemination is part of the job," I explained. "Findings only create change when they're shared with practitioners and policymakers." "All these years," Dad said, returning to his chair, "I've been telling people my daughter works with troubled families, when I should have been saying she develops policies that improve child welfare systems." "Both descriptions are accurate," I pointed out. "Direct practice and policy work are equally important." Dad quietly asked to hear more about my work, and for the first time in 15 years, I found myself explaining research methodology and evidence-based practice to a family member who was genuinely curious about the systematic approach rather than dismissive of the unmeasurable nature. We talked for 2 hours about data collection, outcome measurement, policy development, and the peer review process for academic publication. Dad asked technical questions about research design and statistical analysis that reminded me why I'd been drawn to his logical, problem-solving approach throughout my childhood. "This is nothing like what I imagined when you said social work," he admitted. "I thought you were just listening to people's problems and offering emotional support." "Emotional support is one intervention tool," I said. "But evidence-based practice includes cognitive behavioral therapy, family systems interventions, crisis management protocols, advocacy strategies, and policy development." "Policy development," he repeated thoughtfully. "You're actually helping write the laws that govern child welfare systems." "Research informs policy recommendations," I clarified. "Lawmakers make the final decisions, but evidence-based research provides the foundation for effective legislation." 2 weeks later, when the Child Welfare Modernization Act passed committee review with strong bipartisan support, my family read every news article about the legislation. They understood enough about the policy development process to recognize my research contributions and appreciate the significance of evidence-based reform. Dr. Jennifer Martinez's research on intervention outcomes provided crucial data for lawmakers developing child welfare reform. Dad read aloud from the Policy Journal article at our next family dinner. Her evidence-based approach to social work practice influenced key provisions of the legislation. "That's our Jennifer," Mom said proudly, and for the first time, I felt that my family truly understood what those words meant. The congressional testimony was professionally satisfying, but having my family finally understand and appreciate the systematic research-based nature of modern social work meant more than any policy recognition. They'd learned to see my career not as bleeding heart nonsense, but as rigorous, evidence-based practice that contributed to measurable improvements in child welfare systems. "Next time someone asks what you do," Dad said, "I'm going to need at least 10 minutes to explain it properly. Just tell them I help families," I suggested with a smile. "Everything else is technical details." "Technical details that influence national policy," he added firmly. "And that's exactly how I plan to describe my daughter's career from now on." 6 months later, when the Child Welfare Modernization Act was signed into law, Dad called to congratulate me on my contribution to legislation that would benefit families nationwide. He'd spent months learning about evidence-based practice and could discuss social work research with the same analytical precision he'd once applied to engineering problems. "I understand now why you chose social work," he said during that phone call. "It's systematic problem-solving applied to the most important problems, helping families thrive." "That's exactly what it is," I replied, grateful that my family had finally learned to appreciate the complexity and rigor of evidence-based social work practice.